Apollo 11 space mission will forever be remembered, of course, for putting a man, actually two men, on the moon. Now the third man, who had to pilot the command module, Michael Collins, has died. He was 90 and had had cancer.
As Michael Collins slipped behind the far side of the moon, a haunting silence took hold. For 48 minutes of every orbit, he was the most isolated human in existence. While Neil and Buzz made history in the dust below, Collins watched a different reality unfold through the glass of Columbia. He didn't find ancient ruins or alien lights, but what he actually revealed is far more interesting. Ready to see the moon through the eyes of the man who stayed behind, the moon's true color. Let's imagine Michael's office. While Neil and Buzz were down there playing the ultimate game of hopscotch, Collins was stuck in Columbia. By the way, Columbia is Apollo 11 command module that served as the primary living quarters for the three-man crew.
Propels astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins into space.
It's the only portion of the spacecraft to successfully return to Earth. It wasn't some sprawling starship. It was a metal cone about the size of a walk-in closet. For 21 hours, that was his entire universe. Imagine being hurtling through a vacuum at thousands of miles per hour, pressed up against a thick glass window, watching the moon glide by like a giant silent movie. But here's the thing, he wasn't just seeing a rock. He was seeing a world that seemed to change its mood every time he blinked. It was high definition, panoramic, and honestly, a little bit creepy. The first big reveal? The moon is a total liar when it comes to color. We look up from Earth and see this romantic, pearly glow, right? Collins realized that's just a trick of the light. When the sun was high, the lunar surface looked like dirty beach sand. He actually found it kind of drab. It was a flat, featureless desert that stretched out forever, looking about as exciting as a construction site. But the second the sun started to dip, the moon's true face came out. The shadows turned inky black and so sharp they looked like they could cut you. Those craters weren't just pits anymore. They turned into bottomless abysses. Without an atmosphere to soften things, there's no such thing as twilight on the moon. You're either in blinding, retina-scorching light or a darkness so thick it feels like a physical weight. Collins watched this Terminator line, the edge where day meets night, sweep across the plains like a slow-motion wave. Seeing a mountain peak catch the first ray of morning while its base stayed buried in midnight was, to him, the ultimate magnificent desolation. It was jagged, violent, and ancient. While the guys on the ground were looking at the dirt around their boots, Collins was looking at the entire forest. He was seeing 4 billion years of history written in overlapping crater rims and dried-up lava flows that looked like ink spilled across a gray floor. One of the most intense things he did was play a high-stakes game of Where's Waldo. NASA gave him the coordinates for the landing site, and Collins spent his daylight passes glued to a telescope. He was desperately scanning a wasteland the size of a continent, trying to find a tiny metallic glint that would prove his friends were still alive. He called the lunar module the Bug, and he hunted for it with a level of focus most of us can't imagine. But he never found them. The moon was just too massive and too repetitive. That realization hit him hard. The moon wasn't a playground. It was a vast, indifferent wilderness that could swallow 2 grown men and a spaceship without leaving a trace. It made him feel incredibly small, but also incredibly protective of the 2 guys down there in the dust. Then there was the far side. Every time Columbia dipped behind the moon, Collins was cut off from everyone. No radio, no TV, no one small step, just him and the stars. And man, those stars were something else. Without the Earth's glow or an atmosphere to make them twinkle, they were steady, hard points of light. He said the sky was so crowded with stars, it didn't even look like space anymore. It looked like a solid canopy of glitter. Below him, the moon was just a giant black nothing, blocking out half the universe. It was the ultimate me time, but on a cosmic scale. He wasn't lonely, though. He felt a weird, stoic peace. He was the only sentient being on that side of the moon, watching the stars in a way no human ever had. The coolest thing he saw wasn't even just the moon. It was the earthrise. As he rounded the corner of the lunar limb, the Earth would suddenly pop into view.
That little orb out your window really grabs your attention.
After staring at the monstrous and forbidding moon, a place where humans clearly didn't belong, the Earth looked like a miracle. He described it as a tiny blue bonnet or a fragile Christmas ornament hanging in the middle of nowhere. It was so bright and colorful, it actually hurt his eyes to look at it. This was his big aha moment. The moon was a dead, scarred graveyard, but the Earth was a glowing, pulsating jewel of life. He realized he was looking at every person he ever loved, every city ever built, and every drop of water in existence, and it was all small enough that he could hide it behind his thumb. He also noticed how old everything felt. From his window, he could see where fresh impacts had splashed white rays across the darker ground, like a fresh paint spill on an old floor. He felt like he was a witness to time itself. The moon had been waiting for this moment for billions of years, and it would stay exactly the same for billions more after he left. It was a giant, dusty history book, and he was the only one in the library. He watched the craters like Copernicus glide by, looking like giant white fortresses, and wondered about the relais, those long, winding trenches that looked like dried-up riverbeds. Were they veins of a dying world? He was the ultimate tourist in the ultimate wasteland, recording every peak and valley in his head, knowing he might be the last person to ever see them with such clarity. Even the smells eventually got involved. When Neil and Buzz finally docked back with him, they brought the moon inside in the form of dust. Collins saw the moon with his nose then, describing a scent like spent gunpowder that clung to their suits. But before that reunion, his eyes were his only companions. He watched the horizon, a sharp curved line where the gray dust met the infinite black, and felt a strange connection to it all. He wasn't just orbiting a rock, he was orbiting the very idea of home. This visual feast was his reward for being the third man. It was a silent movie played for an audience of one, featuring the birth and death of worlds, and he had the best seat in the house. As the sun set once more on the lunar plains, the beauty of the view couldn't entirely mask the cold reality of his situation. Were his eyes playing tricks on him, or was the darkness beginning to feel a bit more like a weight than a wonder? Not a wonder, but a secret terror. If you think being alone in a tin can 240,000 miles from home sounds peaceful, Michael Collins would like a word. While the loneliest man in history tag is something the media gave him, the actual internal reality for Collins was much more intense. It wasn't just about the silence, it was about the math. Every time he drifted behind the moon and lost contact with Houston, he wasn't just a pilot, he was a man living in the what if. What if the engine on the Eagle didn't light? What if Neil and Buzz were standing on the lunar surface, looking up at his passing star, knowing they were never coming home? This wasn't some abstract anxiety. It was a cold, hard calculation he carried in his pocket on a piece of paper. Collins later revealed that his secret terror wasn't dying in a fiery explosion. It was the prospect of having to return to Earth alone. He had a nightmare scenario etched into his brain. The Eagle fails to lift off, and he has to be the one to break orbit, leave his two friends to die in the dust, and fly all the way back to Earth as the sole survivor of the greatest tragedy in human history. He imagined the rest of his life as a marked man, the guy who came back while the heroes stayed behind. He even had a contingency plan for what he would say to the widows. That kind of psychological weight is heavier than any moon rock, and it's the part of the reveal that people often skip over for the flashier alien theories. But here's the thing. In the middle of that terror, he found a bizarre kind of clarity. When you're the only person in the universe who isn't being recorded, tracked, or talked to, you start to see the mission differently. He realized that while the world saw 3 men, the reality was a daisy chain of thousands of people. He didn't feel like a lonely explorer. He felt like a single, vital link in a massive human machine. He spent his solo hours checking and rechecking the docking mechanisms, obsessing over the transposition and docking maneuvers that would eventually pull his friends back into the safety of Columbia. He was the gatekeeper. If he messed up his day job, the greatest achievement of the century would turn into a funeral. This leads us to the second part of his revelation, the third-man perspective on humanity itself. When Collins looked at the moon, he saw a hostile, alien desert. When he looked at the stars, he saw an infinite, cold vacuum. But when he looked at the Earth, he didn't see countries, borders, or political squabbles. He saw single, fragile, blue-white marble. This sounds like a cliché now because we've seen the photos, but for Collins, it was a visceral, physical shock. He realized that the Earth wasn't just a place we live. It's a life support system. He saw it as a spacecraft itself, Spaceship Earth, and he was the only one with enough distance to see how small the fuel tank really was. He started to feel a strange protective urge toward the planet. He'd look down at the moon, this scarred gray graveyard that had been beaten up by meteors for eons, and then look back at the Earth, which looked like a glowing jewel of water and air. It changed him. He realized that our squabbles over land and oil were ridiculous when viewed from 60 miles above the moon. He became a humanist in the truest sense of the word. He didn't come back talking about the glory of America. He came back talking about the beauty of us. He saw the mission not as a conquest of the moon, but as a discovery of the Earth. His isolation also gave him a unique view of time. On Earth, we measure time by coffee breaks and commutes. In Columbia, Collins measured time by orbits. Every 2 hours, he saw a sunrise and a sunset. He saw the earthrise 30 times. This distorted his sense of reality in a way that Neil and Buzz didn't experience. They were busy with the immediate, collecting rocks, setting up experiments, not falling over in low gravity.
More than 840 pounds of samples were collected from the moon between 1969, a collection of rock that scientists are still learning.
Collins was the one with the luxury, or the curse, of reflection. He was the philosopher pilot. He spent his time thinking about the long game of human evolution. If we could get to the moon, where else could we go? And more importantly, why were we so bad at taking care of the place we started? There was also a very human side to his revelation that often gets left out of the history books, the mundane reality of space. While he was pondering the cosmos, he was also dealing with the fact that the command module was a mess. He was the housekeeper of the mission. He was managing the waste systems, the oxygen levels, and the constant hum of the electronics. He joked later that while Neil and Buzz were making history, he was having hot coffee and listening to music. But the truth was, he was working like a dog to keep that ship alive. His revelation was that space travel isn't just about the giant leap. It's about the millions of tiny, boring steps that make the leap possible. When the Eagle finally did ignite its engine and began the climb back up to him, the relief Collins felt was almost spiritual. He watched that tiny speck of a ship grow larger and larger in his window, and for the first time in nearly a day, the weight of the marked man lifted. He wasn't going to have to go home alone. He wasn't going to be the survivor of a tragedy. He was just a pilot again, ready to catch his friends and bring them back to the blue marble. The reveal he shared with them wasn't about what he saw on the far side, but about how much he missed the sound of another human voice. We are a social species, designed for connection, and even the most beautiful view in the galaxy is empty if you don't have anyone to share it with. This sense of interconnectedness became the foundation of his life after NASA. He didn't want to be the lone wolf anymore. He wanted to be the one reminding everyone that we're all on the same crew. He was leaving the moon, but he was taking a piece of its silence with him, a silence that told him exactly who we are and why we matter. The making of a third man. Collins's seat on Apollo 11 wasn't a consolation prize. It was an engineering masterpiece. In the world of test pilots and astronauts, there's a pecking order. Sure, everyone wants to be the guy with the boots in the dust, but the Command Module Pilot, CMP, was the mission's intellectual anchor. If Neil and Buzz were the explorers, Mike was the captain of the ship that made exploration possible.
Command Module Pilot Mike Collins, that you and Neil and Buzz headed out here to launch to be the first humans to set foot on the surface of the moon.
And he didn't just fall into that role. He was forged for it through years of breaking jets and surviving close calls that would make most people swear off flying for life. The road to Columbia started long before 1969. Collins was a classic product of the Right Stuff era, a West Point grad and an experimental test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base. This wasn't a place for the faint of heart. Edwards was where you went to see if a plane would fly or fall out of the sky like a lead brick. That training gave him a specific kind of gallows humor and a pragmatic soul.
While Michael Collins practices separately to fly the command module,
he didn't look at a rocket and see a glorious chariot. He saw a collection of 8 million parts, all of which were likely to break at the worst possible moment. He was a guy who valued checklists over cheers, and that mindset is exactly what kept him sane when he was 60 miles above the lunar surface with nobody to talk to but himself. Before Apollo, there was Gemini 10. This was Collins's first real taste of the weirdness of space, and it almost went sideways in a very public way. During a spacewalk, he became one of the first humans to actually walk.
Sort of that feeling of release, of freedom, of getting out of a confined space, of having the whole world at your feet.
Or rather, stumble between two different spacecraft in orbit. But here's the conversational twist. While he was out there, he actually lost his camera. It drifted away into the void, a tiny metal tourist lost forever in the stars. He also recalled the sheer, unglamorous physical struggle of moving in a pressurized suit. He described it as trying to do a puzzle while wearing oven mitts and being inside a balloon. This wasn't a graceful ballet. It was a sweaty, grunting wrestling match with physics. These experiences taught him that space doesn't care about your ego. It only cares about your oxygen levels and your fuel. By the time Apollo 11 rolled around, Collins had developed what he called the daisy chain philosophy. He realized that for Neil to take that one small step, a million things had to go exactly right, and most of those things were invisible to the public. He was the one managing the transposition and docking, that terrifying maneuver right after launch where he had to pull Columbia away from the rocket, turn it 180 degrees, and nosedive it into the lunar module to pull it out of its housing. It's like trying to thread a needle while driving two semi-trucks at 17,000 miles per hour. If he missed, the mission ended before it even reached the moon. He didn't miss. He was the ultimate operator, the guy who made the impossible look like a routine Tuesday. This brings us to his role during the actual landing. While the world was breathless, listening to the 1202 and 1201 computer alarms as Neil dodged boulders in the Eagle, Collins was high above, acting as the mission's silent guardian. He wasn't just sitting there twiddling his thumbs. He was running a solo marathon of what-ifs. He had a notebook filled with 18 different rendezvous maneuvers, each designed to save his friends if they had to abort the landing at a moment's notice. He was the ultimate safety net. He didn't feel left out. He felt essential. He knew that if the Eagle came back up in the wrong spot, or with a dead battery, or with a leaking tank, he was the only person in the universe who could go get them. After the mission, the forgotten astronaut didn't fade into the shadows. He took that third-man perspective and used it to build something that would outlast his flight. He became the director of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Think about that for a second.
The National Air and Space Museum. Today I am joined by Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins.
The guy who lived the history was now the guy tasked with telling it. He didn't want a boring museum filled with dusty plaques. He wanted a place that captured the feeling of being up there. He was the one who pushed to get the museum built on the National Mall in time for the 1976 bicentennial. He turned a government project into a temple of human curiosity, but perhaps his greatest reveal came in the form of ink on paper. His autobiography, Carrying the Fire, is widely considered the best book ever written by an astronaut. Why? Because he didn't write like a hero. He wrote like a human. He talked about the smell of urine in the spacesuits, the wetbacks, newbies who didn't know how to use the bathroom in zero-G, and the sheer absurd comedy of 3 grown men living in a tin can for 8 days. He pulled back the curtain on the godlike image of astronauts and showed us the sweaty, tired, scared, and brilliant people underneath the helmets. He reminded us that you don't have to be a superhero to do something super. You just have to be willing to do the work. In his later years, Collins didn't sit around talking about the good old days with a beer in his hand. He became a quiet advocate for the next big leap, Mars. He famously said that the moon was a withered, sun-seared peach pit. But Mars? Mars was a destination. He wanted us to keep looking up. He also took up watercolor painting, capturing the soft, fluid colors of Earth that he had seen from his window. It was as if he was trying to spend the rest of his life recreating that one perfect earthrise he saw 30 times in 1969. He lived with a wise perspective, a mix of sharp wit and a quiet sense of purpose that he gained by looking back at our planet from the vantage of the void. When Michael Collins passed away in 2021, he left behind a legacy that was different from Neil's or Buzz's. He wasn't the first to step or the second to follow. He was the one who stayed behind to make sure they could come home. He taught us that loneliness is a matter of perspective. He wasn't lonely, he was it. He was the one man who held the entire history of humanity in his forward field of view and decided that it was worth protecting. He carried the fire, not for himself, but for all of us. And in the end, that might be the biggest revelation of all. You don't need to walk on the moon to be changed by it. You just need to be the one who keeps the engine running. He often joked that when he saw a beautiful moon at night, he'd catch himself thinking, "Hey, that looks good." And then he'd remember, "Oh, wait, I went up there once." It was that blend of humility and awe that made him the most relatable man in the stars. He knew he had a happy little home back on Earth, and he spent every orbit of his life making sure we realized how lucky we are to have one too. As he finally closed the door on his long journey, one question lingers for the rest of us. If one man could see the whole world in a single window and find it beautiful enough to stay behind for, what are we doing to make sure that Blue Bonnet stays bright for the next person who looks? Remember the mission's legacy. The domino effect. If you think the Apollo 11 legacy is just about grainy footage and a can-do spirit, you're missing the biggest part of the story. In 2026, we are living in the long tail of that mission. While the world celebrated the landing as a finite event, a checkbox in history, the scientific and cultural fallout didn't stop when the astronauts splashed down.
I have the privilege of speaking for so many and welcoming you back to Earth.
In fact, some of the most shocking revelations from the mission didn't even happen until decades after the crew retired. Take the moon rocks, for instance. Neil and Buzz hauled back about 48 pounds of lunar material.
The Lunar Sample Laboratory, collection of moon rock. Humanity's first samples taken from another world.
Which sounds like a light weekend of landscaping. But those rocks were a Trojan horse of data. For years, scientists believed the moon was bone dry. It was a dead, dusty rock with zero water. But by re-examining those original 1969 samples with 21st century technology, tools Michael Collins couldn't have even dreamed of, researchers discovered that water is actually locked inside the minerals. This changed everything. It transformed the moon from a place to visit into a place to live, paving the way for the current Artemis missions to target the lunar South Pole for ice. We are literally building our future on the dust of 1969. Then there's the armalcolite. Most people don't know that the Apollo 11 crew actually has a mineral named after them. Scientists found a new type of titanium-rich mineral in the samples and named it by combining Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. This wasn't just a cool naming ceremony. It revealed that the moon had a violent volcanic past. It proved that the moon wasn't just a captured asteroid, but a sibling of Earth, likely born from a massive collision billions of years ago. Every time a geologist looks at a slide of armalcolite today, they are seeing proof of our planet's chaotic birth, a secret the moon held onto until 3 guys in a tin can went to grab it. Beyond the rocks, the legacy of Apollo 11 is etched into our everyday pockets. People love to talk about Tang and Velcro, but the real spin-off was the death of the giant computer. To get Columbia and Eagle to the moon, NASA needed to shrink computers that once filled entire rooms down to something that could fit on a dashboard. This push for miniaturization effectively fast-forwarded the digital age by a decade. Without the desperate need to save weight on Michael Collins' control panel, the microchip revolution would have stalled. You're likely reading this on a device that shares a direct DNA link to the Apollo guidance computer, a machine that had less processing power than a modern toaster, yet managed to navigate across the void. Culturally, the mission did something even more radical. It gave humanity a species-level ego boost. For 2 million years, Homo sapiens looked at the moon and saw a god, a clock, or a mystery. After 1969, we saw it as a destination. It changed the definition of impossible. We now use the term moonshot to describe any massive, multi-generational effort, from curing cancer to solving climate change. The legacy of Apollo 11 is the belief that if you throw enough math, money, and courage at a problem, the laws of physics will eventually blink first. It shifted our identity from a terrestrial species to a spacefaring one. Even the way we view our own planet changed because of that trip. While the earthrise photo from Apollo 8 started the conversation, the Apollo 11 crew solidified it. They came back talking about the lack of borders. They saw a world that was one because from 240,000 miles away, you can't see the fences, the flags, or the fighting. This perspective was a massive catalyst for the modern environmental movement. It's no coincidence that the first Earth Day happened just months after the landing. We went to the moon to explore the magnificent desolation, but the ultimate legacy was the realization that we were living on the only wet rock in the neighborhood, and we'd better start acting like it. In 2026, as the Artemis program prepares to put the first woman and the first person of color on the moon, they aren't just following in the footsteps of the Apollo crew, they are building on a foundation of data that is still being mined. We are still opening sealed vacuum containers from the 70s because our current lab equipment is finally good enough to understand what's inside. The mission never actually ended. It just went into a long, productive, slow cook phase. The legacy of the third man and his crewmates is a reminder of human potential. They showed us that we are at our best when we are looking outward. They turned the sky from a ceiling into a hallway. As we look toward Mars and beyond, we realize that Apollo 11 wasn't the peak of our story. It was just the prologue. It taught us that while the moon is a cold, forbidding place, the fire we carry to get there is what actually matters. Stay curious, keep looking at the stars, and don't forget to subscribe for more in this very channel.